All right. Welcome everybody to the meeting of the Environmental Rules Review Committee. It's 1 o'clock, so we'll get started. We've got a quorum here. The first item on the agenda today is the committee roll call. I'll turn it over to Dale for that.
Chuck Lipstrow. Here. Helen Taylor. Here. Grant Trigger. Here. Daniel Frakes. Here. Dave Manis. Here. Vadim Mored. Here. Robert Niederhood.
Here.
Jeremy Orr.
Here.
Eric Pessel. Here. James Cliff.
Here.
Kirk Lanfrom.
Here.
Deb Mackenzie Taylor. Here. Jim Johnson.
Present.
And Melissa Stoltz. Is there Melissa Stoltz?
I think I think Dave's checking on her, so should be on her way here. Just two housekeeping items quickly. One is, you can see we've got microphones today, so if you just hit the button, it'll turn green and you can talk for the committee members here. The second item, which was noted to me after the last meeting, is there were some comments made about excessive checking of phones during the meeting. So, not that you can't pull out your phone and look at it, but try to limit that to the extent possible so it doesn't cross the line into some type of Open Meetings Act violation. So just be conscious of that as we move forward through the meeting today. The second item on the agenda is the introduction of our two new committee members, one of whom is here, Chuck Lipstrow. Welcome aboard. Chuck is the president of the Michigan Agribusiness Association. So he was appointed to the committee spot representing a statewide agricultural organization for a term expiring October 2021. So Chuck, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And then Melissa Stoltz is the second new member. She's the Sustainability and Innovations Manager for the City of Ann Arbor. She was appointed to the committee spot representing local governments for a term ending October 2021. So appreciate both of you and your service. Okay, the third item on the agenda for today, another administrative matter. And when Mark Fowler resigned from the committee, we lost our vice chair. And as folks know, that is an important role on this committee, because when new rule sets come through, the chair and the vice chair can sort of off-ramp those from the process. And so we do need to appoint a new vice chair. Thankfully, Eric Pessel has agreed to serve in that role. I appreciate his willingness to serve. And so I would accept a motion to appoint Eric as the new vice president. Second? Second. All right. All in favor of appointing Eric as vice president? You better vote yes.
Notice you've been elevated to vice president.
Vice chair, yeah, exactly. All in favor of appointing Eric as vice chair, say aye. 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 All right, Eric, congratulations, I guess. Okay, the fourth item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting.
Motion to approve.
Frakes, Manis. All in favor of approving the agenda? Aye. Those opposed? Okay. The agenda is approved. The fifth item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the January 30th meeting of the committee, which should be in your packet. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the January 30 minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Who seconded that?
Eric. Okay, on to the business of the day. Next item on the agenda is a summary of public comments and changes to the final supplying water to the public, or PFAS draft rules. And Eric Oswald, the director of the Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division, is here to give us an update on how the rules have changed in the public comment process that we heard about at our last meeting. So I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. So quickly, go ahead, Dave, if you can go to the next slide. So just a review of the public comment period, it opened up on the 19th of December when we announced where the public hearings were going to take place. We had 3 public hearings that are identified up there in Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, and Roscommon. And the public comment period closed on the 31st of January. It's interesting to note that in the morning when I came to work, we had about 500 comments. When we came in on Monday morning, we left it open until midnight on January the 31st, just to give folks the benefit of the doubt. We had over 3,300 comments by the time it closed at midnight. So a lot of comments in that last day. So if we can go to the next slide. So here's just kind of a summary of the comments that we received. We had 82 oral comments in those 3 public hearings. 11 written comments were given to us at the public hearings. We had 8 via old-fashioned U.S. Post Office mail. And then you get some numbers for the overall attendance, both in person at the public hearings and folks listening via live streaming. So in the model that JCARS gave us, they only give us 2 categories. It's comments of support and comments in opposition. We really had what we felt were 3 comment categories. We had ones that were obviously in support, obviously in opposition, but we had some that were neutral. So we kind of created our own 3rd category of neutral, and we're gonna, those are included in your packet. So we're gonna send over kind of a modified set of categories. So just a summary of the numbers, comments directly in favor, about 2,600 of those. And again, we looked for specific language on that. Neutral comments, about 820. Again, didn't directly support or oppose the rule. And again, comments in clear opposition were only 16. So we had, and I'll recognize Ian Smith over there. If you can raise your hand, Ian, thank you. He's the one that had the task of going through these comments and categorizing, and so he did a lot of work as well as the whole team going through these. I will say that the comments that were on the health-based values and the science and those things were sent over to MPART. As we stated before, Eagle didn't develop those numbers, so we felt it was best to go back to MPART and get their evaluation on those comments that were specifically about the Science Advisory Work Group and the value and the science behind those. So we looked at the categories. We had a top 7, if you will, categories of concern with the rules. So we kind of broke those down, and I'll go over each of those 7 categories and kind of our response to them. And then there were some categories about the regulatory impact statement as well, so I'll address those. So on the first category, or the first general category of comment concern there, Eagle must take into account all new data science in determining the appropriate levels used in developing the PFAS MCLs. So this was the most popular concern, if you will. And again, these are kind of our response to that comment, and again, MPART took a methodical approach in identifying the 7 compounds. We recognize that this is a group of emerging concern and that science will be developing as we go along. And in response to that, we did create in the Drinking Water and Environmental Health section a unit that Ian Smith heads up that does address contaminants of emerging concern. So we take that very seriously. We have a division of about 5 or 6 staff that is dedicated to doing that. So we feel we can be responsive to new concerns. Okay, next slide. So the second one was Eagle should consider using a class-based approach in developing the MCL. Again, the consideration by the Science Advisory Work Group that current technical techniques weren't particularly useful. The EPA recognized methods that we're using only identify a certain group of between 14 or so or 28 PFAS chemicals. So to regulate these as a group and regulate the whole 4,000 categories or 4,000 individual chemicals is problematic, as we can't really identify all 4,000 of those with an EPA recognized method. So that makes this very difficult. We could use a surrogate approach, total fluorinated compounds, but it really doesn't identify where the fluorine is coming from. So we don't think this is practical at this time. And in addition, there's an orders of, if you see the MCLs for these chemicals, there's an orders of magnitude difference in some of them. So to try and regulate them as a class would de facto regulate them in the low single-digit parts per trillion, and we didn't think that was appropriate, nor did the Science Advisory Work Group, based on the science that we have at the time. So, next comment. Michigan must be a leader in developing PFAS MCLs. We feel that the state is a leader. We were the first state to do a statewide survey of our drinking water systems. We're also the first state, as far as I know, things change on a daily basis, that are establishing MCLs for 7 compounds and a Gen X compound. We're the only ones that have a Gen X MCL proposed. And again, the statewide survey and the approaches that we've taken, it's interesting to note Environmental Working Group has identified the state as the single state in the United States with the most PFAS sites, so to speak, and that is because we are very aggressively looking for these sites. So I think Michigan has demonstrated that we are a leader as far as developing a response to PFAS contamination in the environment. Next. So the fourth was Eagle should include a combined PFAS MCL, including some or all of the 7 compounds proposed. Again, we go back to the Science Advisory Work Group and their judgment on this. And again, as I mentioned before, the orders of magnitude difference between some of the health-based values, which became the MCLs, make it problematic to establish a number that applies to all of these compounds as a class, similar to the 70 parts per trillion that EPA proposed for PFOA and PFOS. And again, we will be looking, as the science evolves, our emerging contaminants unit will be reviewing that science in conjunction with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Michigan's MCLs must be at a level which is protective of its most vulnerable population. I think the Science Advisory Work Group did a fairly good job of demonstrating that, and that health-based value derivation was based on a look at the most vulnerable populations for the science that they evaluated. Number 6, again, Michigan's MCLs must be protective of public health. That was the whole charge to the Michigan Science, the MPART Science Advisory Work Group. And during the rulemaking process, it's important to note that we could have deviated and raised the MCLs from the health-based values. We chose not to do that, so the MCLs were set at the protective health-based values, so they weren't changed. So we feel they are protective of public health. Number 7, the last comment, Eagle must complete rulemaking or rule promulgation more quickly. We've had criticism on both sides that we're moving too fast and that we're moving too slow. I will say, as far as regulations go, we are moving, I don't want to say light speed in a bad way, but we are moving very quickly. We got the charge in April of 2019, and we're on track to have the MCLs close to a 1-year process, so that is pretty quick. So we believe we are responding very quickly, and that we are in effect meeting the spirit of this comment. The regulatory impact statement got a lot of comments, concerns about how realistic it was. There were some general comments about the impact to small systems, and I will say that we did revise the cost to small systems based on our experience in Robinson Elementary School. We placed a premium on treatment installation for small systems, which upped our installation costs. So we feel we responded to that impact. Again, there's other comments about GAC's effectiveness at the shorter chain, that GAC is preferential to longer chains, and there is some science that supports that. However, we do not mandate GAC. GAC is only what we consider the best available treatment technology. Systems are free to choose whatever systems or treatment mechanisms that demonstrate that they can remove the contamination to below the MCLs. And they can also look at changing their source of water. So if you've got one well that's high in PFAS, you don't need to necessarily treat that well. If you can find another well that doesn't have PFAS in it, you can abandon that well in place. And that's an option that we think a lot of systems will choose, is to alter their water source. So we addressed those. We feel that we responded to the RIS and we met the regulatory requirement there. And again, your packets, and I apologize for the size of the packet for this meeting. It was extremely large. I went through and went through all the comments that were in your packet, and it took me a while to do that. So, but you know, we felt it was important to provide you a good summary of that. So with that, the proposed rule changes, we really didn't see anything that moved us off of the rules that we had. We had some typos that were identified with 2 of the chemical abstract service registry numbers. We went ahead and made those changes, and those are the only 2 changes that we have made to the rule at this point based on the public comment period. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions that you might have, comments or concerns.
Questions?
How long did it take you to go through all the comments?
Ian, it took, well, it took a while. We closed it out on the Monday after the 31st in probably 3 weeks of.
I had some help and a very good team. We got through them as quickly as we could. It's probably at least close to a couple.
There's a lot of, as you can understand, a lot of outside interest in getting those comments. Okay.
Oh, one thing, when you make a comment, we want to make sure you speak in the microphone with it on. So we just want to make sure that the people on live stream can hear the questions and comments.
Thank you, David. How to teach a new habit. My question was how long it took to go through the comments, because they're lengthy, and I haven't had a chance to go through all of them either. But I think it's a tribute to the interest, the length of some of the comments, and the depth of them. Impressive for what I've seen so far.
Yeah, there were some very well thought out and some very detailed reports that we received that we went through and took very seriously. We were getting emails from press on the 31st asking for the public comments, but it took us a while, 3 weeks to go through those. So we basically sent those out at the same time we sent your packet out. So.
I have a follow-up question. It seemed, from what I've seen thus far, that there was maybe more substance to the comments than is reflected in the summary. And, yeoman's effort to organize the review, but it seemed the summary was a little light. And what I've seen thus far, there were some places, for example, I think it was the Environmental Council, and I was just looking for it now. As David clued in, you can search the PDF, the 672 pages to find individual entries. And one of the things I thought the council did was they drafted a section of the rules that would make it obligatory to do a 2-year review of the science. And the response was, well, we have a way to do that, so we don't need to add it to the rule. And can you comment on that? Because it seemed logical to include a provision because it verifies in the rules what's been verbally committed to. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. And it's problematic to, as an agency to be required to review a rule set on a specified basis. We only have a rule set open, one rule set open at a time, so if we're required to do a change, it kind of impacts other things we may want to do. We just felt that because the evolving science, the nature of the emerging contaminants unit, our partnership with Health and Human Services, that we have a pretty good grasp, and MPART, that there's a lot of agencies working on this, and this is going to be reviewed, and it is reviewed on a continual basis. It's not just every 2 years. I mean, we've got people looking at this continuously. So we thought that the 2-year review, although it's not a bad idea, we didn't think it was necessary. We just felt that this was being done.
I've been doing this for a long time, and I probably should know the answer to this, so pardon me for asking the question, but I suspect there's somebody in the room who knows the answer. If someone felt that there was information that should be reviewed, is there an opportunity to petition for a review of the standards?
Well, I defer to James on that.
The answer is yes, and anybody can petition the department to revise any rule that's under our jurisdiction.
Oh, here.
The question is there a petition process? And I do believe there's a general petition process where anybody can petition the department to review and revise any rule that's under our jurisdiction.
Have you ever done that?
Have I ever done that?
Before you joined the department?
I don't remember. I do not recall.
And there certainly
thank
is
you.
legislative opportunities. We get questions from legislators all the time, so there's an opportunity for a constituent to contact their representatives to ask for that as well. And we certainly get those inquiries on a routine basis about different rule sets, so that avenue is available as well.
Very good. One of the things, there was, in some of the public comments, there was some very technical work, the comments that were submitted by some of the entities commenting. In particular on the work that the Scientific Advisory Work Group did, the level of detail they went into, the studies they looked at, that sort of thing. And I know you asked MPART to review those and then see if they thought that the advisory group needed to, was there any reason for them to change their conclusions? But in just reading your comment that we have in the packet, I don't get the impression that they actually asked the work group if they had a chance to review those comments and saw anything in there
Yeah. Now this.
that would cause them to want to make any changes.
Yeah, and in transparency, they did not go back to the actual members of the Science Advisory Work Group. MPART used its public health work group to review those. The Science Advisory Work Group was a group that was put together ad hoc, so they're back out in their whatever they do on a day-to-day basis. So
Right.
Steve Sliver made the executive decision that we were going to go to MPART's public health work group, and they're the ones, then they're toxicologists that reviewed that and gave us that comment back. So yeah, that's very true. The Science Advisory Work Group was not reconvened to review these comments. Yes. You want the
This is actually hot off the press this week. We did reach out to the Science Advisory Work Group members this week. We did call out a number of comments that we requested they evaluate, and they did that, and their conclusion was that their original recommendations are still appropriate and public health protective.
I think it might be good to capture that in the documentation somewhere in the packet. So we get that, know that we've gotten that feedback.
we'll do that.
Just kind of piggybacking on Dave's question, this might be oversimplifying a little bit, but you noted the very technical comments that really get to the health-based values and the various studies that are out there, and that to me kind of seems like one category of comments or area of regulation that needs to be monitored going forward. And then you've got I'll just call it more regulatory issues. What do we do once we have the right health-based values and MCLs, and how do we interact with the stakeholders to regulate that appropriately? On that first category, the very technical, say a new study comes out and it changes everybody's thinking, or another state regulates it a different way and we see how their experience worked. Who will be responsible for keeping tabs on that going forward and making the call that, now's the time to revisit these
Right.
health-based values and tweak these? Is it the Science Advisory Group? Is it MPART? Is it?
It would be MPART, and it would be Steve Sliver and the Public Health Advisory Group that's part of MPART that's continuously reviewing those. That's who we would look to review those and make recommendations to us.
Okay.
And again, our emerging contaminants unit, for the first time ever in drinking water, we are going to hire a toxicologist and have a toxicologist on staff, because that's a function, an expertise we don't have right now that we're getting because of PFAS and other issues that are occurring in our water supply around the state.
Thanks.
Eric, just one question. This may need support from Ian, but you know, there seemed to be quite a number of comments that were in the neutral category, and you know, how were those evaluated, or what was the theme behind those, and how was it determined that they were neutral versus for or against? I think this would be.
Yeah, it was tough because they
Better to
didn't
learn
come right
about
out and say we support or we oppose this. You know, they acknowledged the MCLs, and then they would go on to say, okay, here's my recommendation for approving it. So it really wasn't in opposition or support explicitly, and we wanted that explicit message in the comment. We didn't want to interpret whether somebody was opposed or in favor of it. So if it didn't explicitly say that, we called it neutral, and then took their comment. And if there's any addition or modification to that.
So generally, those neutral comments would, just to give you a kind of a conceptualization, they would be a list of recommendations. Those recommendations were very much in line with the recommendations that would typically come with a positive comment. And those are reflected in those 7 categories of concern for the most part. So that was taken into account as well.
We just didn't want to put them in favor because there wasn't an explicit
Put words in
I'm
them
in
all.
favor statement or I oppose statement.
Yes.
Other questions from the committee?
I shared some comments and questions earlier this week, primarily focused on 201 issues. Is there someone who's prepared to respond to those questions?
We have Eric's from RRD. I mean, obviously we have the 2 established groundwater cleanup standards in the 201 for PFOA and PFOS that will change based on these MCLs. The other 5, they'd have to go through a rulemaking process to establish groundwater cleanup standards. But beyond that, I would defer to RRD as far as, is there specific?
Well, for clarity purposes, I shared the list of questions, and I'm asking who's going to respond to them. Because the issue with respect to the secondary effect of these rules is based on understanding these consequences. And I want to know who's going to respond to those questions, because there's a list of them here. If you'd like, I'll walk through them, or we can have somebody respond to them.
Yeah, and I would defer to RRD for a response to those questions. I'm not sure if Eric, if you're prepared to respond to those.
Some of them, yes.
Okay.
Did you just want to start at the top and kind of work through the subject matter?
Well, I mean, I think the basic point is, do you agree with how I read the changes in the criteria, and particularly the soil standards protective of groundwater? For example, that the applicable soil standard for protective of GSI for PFOA would now be 160 parts per trillion, or 0.16 parts per billion?
Specifically with respect to that one, I would say no at this point, because the GSI criteria are based off of the water resources water quality standards. Those have not been updated, and they do not directly default to the potentially incoming MCLs. That's a whole different process, so they're not exactly tied together.
So then with respect to PFOS, current standard's 0.24 parts per billion. You say it wouldn't change to 0.3, it'll stay at 0.24?
The soil criteria associated with that pathway are tied to the water quality standards. So until the water quality standards themselves change, the soil criteria associated with those would not change.
And
Right,
with respect, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, right now, the word that I'm hearing from Water Resources is that there is no intention to update those immediately. They are reevaluating them based on the new data, but there is no time frame for updating those water quality standards.
So then when we get to the soils protective of drinking water, those standards would change, would they not?
If we go through the promulgation process to do that, yes.
And do you agree that the PFOA standard would now be 0.16 parts per billion?
We have not calculated those values yet.
It's 20 times the proposed MCL. That's the generic number, right?
We have not calculated those yet, so there are two methods for determining that value. The 20 times is one method for doing so. The other one is the soil water partition value, and the larger of those two values, the larger of those two outcomes would represent the soil criterion going forward.
So you're saying you don't know what the soil water partition factors are?
We've not conducted those calculations yet, no.
But in the absence of those numbers, you would use 20 times the drinking water number, would you not?
No. We would have to conduct the evaluation to determine if the necessary data were available to calculate that soil water partition value. We've not done that yet.
So what about PFOS? Is that going to change?
Again, we've not conducted that yet, so I can't really speak to what the outcome of that would be until we've done those calculations.
So you're saying that it's not RD's intent going forward when these rules are adopted to apply 20 times as a standard, because you've been doing it for the last year?
The values that are currently in the table would stand until a promulgation takes place to update those values.
But this is what I don't understand. What do you have to promulgate? If the MCL, if these rules are adopted, the standard practice of the department for the last 20 years is 20 times the value. And you're saying you're not going to apply that going forward?
The MCLs for PFOS and PFOA would affect the current drinking water criteria that are in the tables right now. The soil criteria associated with those could not be changed until they undergo a promulgation process. So the values that are currently in the tables would stand until that
But
time.
wait a minute. Somebody needs to explain this to me, because that's not the way this has been done for 20 years. You have to go through a promulgation process to evaluate the soil water partition, and until you do that, you won't apply 20 times?
To change an existing value, we would have to go through a promulgation event.
So let me ask another question. Is the department now, or considering to prepare any notices of violation for anybody who's applied biosolids or compost anywhere in the state of Michigan with PFAS in those biosolids or compost?
I don't know that I can speak to that. Yeah, John?
So I think the word that you use that's key is intent, and what do we intend to do with regard to soil concentrations for PFAS in terms of how they relate to soil to groundwater and to surface water concentrations. And we're doing a lot of work in the department to try and sort that out. I think part of the question is we don't understand fate and transport of these chemicals entirely in terms of how they move from soil to groundwater or surface water. And I think until we get a better understanding of that we wouldn't rush to apply the 20 times standard. We are doing work on fate and transport modeling for soils on fields where biosolids have been land applied. We're trying to relate what we see in groundwater at those sites to what we see in soil, and we're trying to establish an appropriate model to try and do some of that evaluation. In the absence of criteria from the EPA on biosolids, we're having to do a lot of this work ourselves. And there is other work going on across the state to try and sort that out. Until we get a better understanding of that, I think that we're not intending to send any violation notices to anyone in that regard. I don't think we would send violation notices to somebody that was a landowner that received biosolids. I think it's a very complicated issue, and we're trying to tread very carefully on this. It affects a lot of different people, And I think that we don't want to, establish a property as being contaminated or a facility until we have very good information that would indicate that there's a risk associated with that. So there's a lot of work going on, but it is still, we're still in the process of evaluating all those things.
Does that also apply to general excavation of soils for construction purposes and road building and so forth?
That goes back to RRD again, but I think that we've encountered some of those scenarios across the department, and we've evaluated those as we go forward, the best that we can in the absence of very good information, and we're making decisions on a site-specific review basis for those kind of scenarios when we encounter them.
But if you're making those decisions, what criteria are you applying?
It depends on the scenario. I mean, I think Eric can speak to this, but they're working on maybe some site-specific review criteria for some properties around the Wolverine plume.
One of the reasons that I think these are important is that the state of Maine just completed a review based on their action levels of a variety of substances, including milorganite. Now, for anyone in the room who doesn't know what milorganite is, it was one of the first pioneered composted fertilizers from wastewater sludges from the city of Milwaukee. The levels of PFAS in milorganite are 3 times the main action level. So we're on the cusp here of a risk of taking an action with these MCLs, subject to the partition coefficients and other factors. That puts things like milorganite, compost, and biosolids all at risk. And here's the other challenge to this. As of 11:45 this morning, I determined based on a series of phone calls, there are 2 places that you can send PFAS-contaminated solids right now. One is US Ecology outside of Ypsilanti at $1,000 a ton. They treat it, pack it, and dispose of it. The second is the Heritage Incinerator in Ohio, and that's about $650 a ton, including shipping costs. So if we adopt these MCLs without clearly understanding the implications of what it means to these other substances, we're at risk of having materials that people who have those materials have no options to deal with them. If they're forced to dispose of them, those are the only 2 options as of 11:45 this morning that are available. And I appreciate the point, John, about trying to understand this stuff, because nobody wants to render the biosolids program ineffective. That's not the point of this. The point is that we're at the edge of putting MCLs in place that automatically become new drinking water standards. And the only way we've been able to deal historically with anything other than the generic 20 times number is leachate tests. And the only 2 leachate tests that are in the rules are T-clip and SPLP. And the research that's ongoing now, as I understand it, with respect to leaching tests, haven't yet figured out what's the appropriate leaching test for PFAS substances in soils or maybe not so much soils, but soils also with high carbon content, because the longer change, as I understand it, are more inclined to be attached to those particles. So without those answers, it seems to me we're unclear of and can't properly characterize the consequences of adopting these rules, not with respect to drinking water supplies, because I think there's been a fair discussion about the focus on drinking water supplies as the first direct exposure route, which is important to control. But if we don't understand these secondary effects, for example, I've provided copies of the City of Ann Arbor's test results from their compost. They average 1.3 parts per billion in their compost right now. And so is that or is that not a violation of the standards? And so without answering that question today, to me, there would be a huge uncertainty. And somebody like Ann Arbor would be at risk of having their compost considered not a hazardous material, but a contaminated material. And the distribution of that in parks and every other portion of the community could be problematic. So understanding these questions are important. I also was able to find a list of 111 registered composting facilities across the state of Michigan, and there's compost in other states where they've done their testing and compared it to their action levels, exceeds the action levels, just like they did it in Maine. So is millworgonite no longer a marketable soil enhancement product? Maine thinks so. So I think this is a real shortcoming at the moment, that we don't understand this in light of adoption of these rules. And I have other questions in here that go to the same fundamental issues, and I know there's work being done in all these areas, and we may not have all the answers right now, but I think that we need to recognize these are potential problems. You're working on biosolids. Who in the department's working on compost issues?
So let me talk a little bit about that.
Please.
So I run the industrial waste beneficial reuse and ran the composting program for a number of years. So we looked at the Ann Arbor numbers, and they're not of a concern to us. We're thinking you need to look at how the stuff's going to be used. It's not the concentration in the material, it's going to be the concentration of material after you mix it with the soil and use it. So we think at a 1 part per billion, if you land apply on a farmland, you're going to get 1,000 to 1 dilution. So that's where we'll start looking at those numbers you were talking about, the 20 times, as a starting point. Then there'll be another point after that from modeling, and then there'll be another point after that through testing, groundwater monitoring and stuff. So yeah, that level, and the only time we think we're going to see those kinds of levels are people that are doing food waste. There's still PFAS in packaging and stuff, so those compostable materials, I know Ann Arbor gets a lot of stuff from U of M. That's probably where it's coming from. We don't want to stop the composting of food waste or those compostable materials. Now, if information comes to light that these numbers are not representative of our other compost facilities, then yeah, we're going to take a relook at that. But those numbers seem to be consistent, across all the stuff we've looked at, especially in Region 5.
So how do you assure that compost material is appropriately applied then to get the dilution factor you've proposed?
I guess the way I look at it, if someone takes home a cubic foot of compost to put in their flower garden, I can't see they can impact surface water with that. If they take a couple yards and put in their garden, I can't see that causing an issue. The issue is going to be a large volume all at one place, like the composting facilities.
So you see focus on the composting facilities, but anticipate dilution through dispersion in the market to mean the way it's used.
The typical
shouldn't
way it's
result
used.
in an excess exposure to basically drinking water or surface water, whatever the final standards are.
Right.
And sounds, John, that biosolids might be the same way. If you control the rate of application, you may also be able to get similar, I don't know if I want to say benefits, but if you evaluate it in the way it's used and applied, you may have similar aspects of your evaluation, that it's not a concentrated use.
Michigan is not unique in this scenario. I mean, basically, concentrations of these chemicals in biosolids and wastewater is the same in Michigan as it is elsewhere in the country and elsewhere in the world in general. And so that's one of the things why we're not rushing to adopt standards like Maine's, is that we want to make sure that we understand this before we do. Their model is based on a very simplistic approach like SPLP or TCLP, and we're not going in that direction. And I think that the answer you're looking for is that, and I don't speak necessarily for the whole department, is there is no rush to judge what constitutes contamination in soils and to label property in that way. I do share your concerns about how we look at this in the future and what ultimately standards will be set by the EPA with regard to regulation of biosolids, or if once we understand how they move in the environment a little better, what that means in terms of those chemicals on the land. But for now, we aren't rushing to make those judgments and to apply those criteria as they exist in the rules. And that's the best answer that I can give. And at my level, we're being very thoughtful. We have been very thoughtful in this process moving forward to try and understand this. We aren't. But I share your concerns, and I understand what your concern is. I don't know that supersedes the benefits of regulating known toxicity in drinking water. That's a different question altogether, and I wouldn't want to confuse those two things. So, that's my response at my level. We are trying very hard to understand this. We are trying very hard to be deliberate in our evaluation of how these things move in the soil, but that's different than understanding what they are in the groundwater and how they might affect people there. So,
To your point about managing the compost, is there a process to communicate to the compost operators? Basically, you got to make sure you do it right, or you're going to create a problem. I mean, what kind of guidance are you anticipating to roll out as a part of what we're talking about today?
so in evaluation of biosolids, it would probably translate to industrial sludges and to also compost with regard to how people might, if we come up with some guidance, screening levels on how biosolids might be land applied, they would probably be useful in those other programs, and as a department, we probably would adopt that approach. We meet together regularly as a group. It's not just biosolids, it's biosolids and industrial sludges and everything else that could be land applied. And so if we came up with the screening criteria that said you could apply so many dry tons per acre at such a concentration, that would apply probably across all of the divisions in terms of the guidance that we would provide. And so we're not there yet, but we're getting reasonably close to being able to provide some information on screening levels. But that is in the absence of complete risk assessment by EPA, who is moving relatively slowly towards giving us help on how we regulate those things.
To come back to the water issue, the Ann Arbor also sampled, and by the way, I give Ann Arbor credit for having taken initiative to sample the materials to try to figure out what's going on because of the wide distribution of materials. But it also suggests that the retention pond water levels will exceed the proposed MCL for PFOA in a drinking water standard. How is that going to be managed? Does that go back to your point about better controls at the composting facilities?
Yeah, that's going to go back to the water regulations. So these guys have an MS4 permit to discharge the surface water. So I doubt they're going to be allowed to discharge the surface water over the surface water criteria unless they do something else. So they might have to add on some GAC or some other things to knock down those concentrations.
Because they refer to these as retention ponds, and I don't know anything about the operation of the facility, that there would be overflows from the retention ponds through an MS4 permit?
So all the water that touches the compost goes into this pond, and then from there, it goes to surface water.
And
Me,
MCLs are not for surface water either.
Melissa, I want to give you an opportunity to speak. And welcome to the committee, by the way.
Thank you. Didn't think I'd speak right away. Just jumping in as
Yeah,
a
sure.
representative from the city of Ann Arbor in this conversation. I think it's really important. Just want to put this on the table that for us, we obviously are concerned about these chemicals. And while there will be financial costs, the biggest concern we have is public health. And so we want to understand what we can be doing to get these chemicals out of the system to begin with. And that is the motivator. And I speak on behalf of everyone within the community. I mean, that is sort of a shared consensus. And I know people share that concern as well. And just while I have the floor, I want to thank the staff and all the public commenters on this process, because this was extraordinarily detailed and really valuable to kind of look through the amount of work that went into this. So thank you for that.
So I'm hoping you have an ability to maybe sample compost from U of M versus your normal, because I think the U of M stuff maybe has more compostable products. So that might be the source of it, but whether it's still coming in with the regular household stuff, I don't know. So is there a way
Right.
to?
I can get back to you on that. I can say that our solid waste system is looking to remove compostable materials packaging out of the compost right now, because that's the source of where this is coming from. So we're doing a lot of public education, and then of course that's tricky as we're moving towards other kind of goals and objectives around food waste, how we're navigating this landscape right now.
And I believe BPI is also going to be setting lower standards for amount of fluorine in those compostable products. I think the current standard is 200 ppm,
Right.
which is way above the numbers that we're tossing around here.
Yeah, lots of work in that space. And then just pivoting really quickly, as a new member, I might not have the privilege of understanding that many others do. I'm curious, as I read these comments and as I followed this literature, the science is moving fast and it's emerging quickly. And I appreciate not wanting to necessarily say we're going to revisit this every 2 years, but can you give me a sense of what is the process like to revise as new science comes forward? Because my gut instinct is these are a good starting point, but these aren't the end.
And that's correct. And the process is,
Oh, here.
as I said before, the process will be to use the MPART process in the Public Health Committee, Advisory Committee that's part of MPART, that has the toxicologist and has that review capacity to advise us on those, on the new science as it emerges. And that's a continual process. That group meets on a routine basis.
Okay, so like quarterly, they're meeting or more
Yeah,
frequently?
I don't know exactly when they're meeting. I'd have to go back to Steve Sliver on that, but they are meeting on a routine basis.
They're actually meeting monthly.
Okay.
It's the Human Health Work Group.
Okay, yeah.
Of
Deb knows
MPART.
better than I do, so yeah, the Human Health Work Group is the one that, yeah. Thank you.
Further questions for the department? If not, thank you, Eric. Appreciate everyone's hard work to go through that process and pull all the comments together and summarize them for the committee. All right, next item on the agenda is public comment. So I've got a few public comment cards here, and I'll call folks up. If anybody has not submitted a card and wants to speak, please do that. The first speaker is Laura Campbell from the Michigan Farm Bureau.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Laura Campbell, and I'm with Michigan Farm Bureau. We represent more than 40,000 farming families across the state and have been following this issue very closely. I want to say, first of all, that we have deep appreciation for the MPART team and the Environmental Rules Review Committee for their transparency and their willingness to share information throughout this whole process. My undergraduate chemistry class did not prepare me for this process, but I was glad to be able to read all of the materials and be a part of that conversation. So we appreciated being part at the table and being able to participate in this. My main concern, and the one that I want to make sure that is emphasized and that this committee understands and that the legislature going through the appropriations process understands, is that we are very, very concerned about the costs of implementation of this rule. We don't have a position on the promulgation of rules for these MCLs. We feel like we definitely do want to be protective of public health, and there's nothing that we've seen that would make us weigh in for or against the process of developing these MCLs or the levels that at which they stand. But our concern is with implementation. So between the farms and agricultural processors who fall under the public water supply rules that would require testing and potential treatment of these chemicals, as well as all of the small community supplies, the cost of implementing treatment if they find levels above those screening requirements or above the MCL allowances is substantial. And they don't have the ability to pass that cost on in any kind of non-painful way to ratepayers. And so when we made our comments in January, and again appreciated the chance to be able to do that, we asked for basically three things. We think that potentially some of these sources and communities for drinking water might need additional time for implementation. They will certainly need additional technical assistance and support, whether that comes from the state agencies or whether that's available through some kind of program or group that's able to come in and help them. And third, they're going to need financial assistance to make sure that we are not either doing a disservice to rural communities and small communities by disallowing them from being able to comply with these requirements, and also not putting out of business any of the businesses, farms, processors, and other people who help to really make the foundation of our agricultural network here in the state from being able to conduct their business because of the cost of making sure that their drinking water is compliant with those state rules. So with those emphases, I want to say thanks again and appreciate the time.
Next speaker is Mara Herman from the Ecology Center. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you. So that was no comment. Next speaker is John Delmas from the Michigan Chemistry Council.
Good afternoon. My name is John Dalmas, and I want to offer some comments on behalf of the Michigan Chemistry Council on these proposed rules, and I appreciate literally the seat at the table with you this afternoon and also the chance we've had to have a seat at the table during this process. I also want to note and begin by saying that everyone deserves access to clean and safe drinking water, and we do support appropriate regulation as part of the state's PFAS response and the work that MPART is doing. And I've been pretty clear that we've had some questions and concerns about this rulemaking from the start, but we were willing to give the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. We shared those concerns with the department and this committee while being a participant throughout the process, and we appreciate all those opportunities. Our biggest concern at the outset and in retrospect has always been the rule's firm and short timeline, which was announced at the start and directed for Eagle to meet. From our experience with rulemaking, this seemed highly unusual and frankly unreasonable given the complexity of the issue. And of that timeline, the most concerning part was the extremely short process for the science work group, which took less than 3 months to recommend the levels that have been unchanged as part of the rule today. Such efforts normally take years, not months, and involve substantial peer review or external review. And we questioned that lack of external review before this committee last June and hope to see that aspect fulfilled later in the process. But I think from our perspective, we don't feel that that aspect has really been fulfilled. We never got what we felt was a satisfactory engagement or response to the questions that were raised about the scientific justifications of different aspects of the rule. We thought perhaps this most recent public comment process would be that opportunity. So to that end, I will just briefly summarize the written comments we supplied, which were still fairly modest compared to others, but in your packet, you can find it there. We noted the state's inexperience with developing drinking water standards and urged the development of more uniform and well-grounded federal standards. We have seen some action on that point, although limited. We noted where the state in its process fell short of the federal process for developing Safe Drinking Water Act standards, including a true cost-benefits analysis, an evaluation of regulatory alternatives, a review of the frequency and level of probable occurrence of the specific contaminants for regulation, and a determination that there was a meaningful opportunity for health risk reductions. We also specifically questioned the proposed regulation of a few of the short-chain PFAS compounds for which our statewide sampling has revealed either scattered levels at very low proportions to the proposed standards or no measured levels at all in one case. And it wasn't clear to us why the state is proposing to regulate these compounds, which no other states have, to our knowledge, proposed for regulation. Beyond our comments, you'll see that numerous parties with very divergent perspectives, some of whom you may also hear from today, provided their own technical comments on both the proposed rule and the regulatory impact statement. And these substantive comments run to several hundred pages in length, as has been noted today. And I think to our disappointment, the department took less than 3 weeks to consider and respond to these comments, and essentially dismissed them all by not making any real changes and providing only a few sentences stating as much, with no real justification why. I honestly, last month, didn't think it would be realistic for this committee to be meeting today to hear and potentially voting on the rules, but remarkably, here we are. And I think you can judge for yourselves whether it's the right course of action at today's meeting. I think it is a little bit unfortunate this issue has been given somewhat of a lacking response to the comments. We don't believe it shows a real consideration of the feedback by many parties. I think this is more of a reflection of the process rather than Eagle staff, again, not something that was necessarily at their discretion. Just one obvious clue to our concern here, while not the whole story, is the fact that the original numbers haven't changed one bit since they were recommended last June, despite all the many comments regarding those numbers, nor has the rule language changed in any real way. So I think there is some question and natural skepticism of the value of the public comment process that we just completed. So as far as next steps, something that you all will have to determine, we would certainly be glad to continue to work with you in the department to address potentially some of these remaining questions and concerns. We do believe the department, is operating in good faith and certainly has been fairly transparent and open during the process. Overall, I would say Michigan continues to have a proactive and protective approach to managing PFAS contamination. We are setting examples for the rest of the country and many other states to follow. And this rule, as written, is very conservative, but it will present new implementation challenges across the state with thousands of systems testing and reporting and on a smaller scale, several smaller systems that will have to install treatment to comply with the standards. And at the end of the day, this process has only reinforced our belief that the federal government remains the best positioned and equipped to develop these kind of standards. And given our experience, we would have even greater doubts that the state should consider undertaking another exercise after these limits are in place. Most importantly, we think that if the rules are finalized, it will be key to ensure that they are being implemented reasonably and effectively, which, again, I trust the state. From everything we've been hearing, their work with the local communities, that is, of course, the ultimate goal. So with that being said, thank you for your time.
The final card here is from Dave Greco, Michigan Manufacturers Association.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Dave Greco from the Michigan Manufacturers Association. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'll start by saying we agree that the safety of public drinking water supplies is paramount, as is the public confidence in drinking water safety. Since that trust and safety of drinking water supplies is paramount, it requires us to get this right. Our formal comments included a technical peer review and scientific evaluation of the proposed rules, which found several gaps and scientific shortcomings that we think ought to be further considered before moving forward. In our report, we also encouraged Eagle to do 4 different things. First, we wanted them to fully address the questions and information gaps presented during the public comment period. Second, we encouraged them to rely on settled science and the newest and best available science. Third, provide for regulation-ready rules that are clear, consistent, and certain. And finally, as many of the formal comments in your packet note, that there needs to be a full, proper accounting of the costs for municipal water systems, citizens, and employers. We remain concerned about the scientific and technical credibility of the proposed rules, the ability of municipalities and their customers to afford adherence with them, and Michigan's overall economic competitiveness when regulations such as these are not consistent or aligned with the federal government or surrounding state standards. I'd also like to note that as part of our comments, one of the studies in our peer review was completed by Dr. Durison. His study just recently won Paper of the Year by the Society of Toxicology, and because of that award, Dr. Durison's paper is now being used by the US EPA as the federal government moves forward with its work to regulate PFOA and PFOS. As the ERRC considers approving PFAS standards for community drinking water systems, we would urge the committee to carefully evaluate all the formal comments that were submitted on the proposed rules before the rules are advanced to JCAR. Given that this report is nearly 1,000 pages long and was released just last Friday, we believe more time is needed to fully consider the matter before this committee. We would urge the ERRC to utilize more of the 120 days available to it to ensure a completed assessment and informed vote before moving the rules forward. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
All right, if there's no other additional public comment, then we will move on.
Before we're going,
Sure.
can I return for a moment to where we left off the questions on the 2-1 criteria?
Yeah, I guess if you have a follow-up question, go ahead.
I'm still trying to sort through this because I think that the responses today require some form of guidance from the department to everybody in the state who's dealing with these things, because for the past year, 0.24, 240 parts per trillion has been applied to the relocation of soils. If that's still going to be the number, and it's not going to change to 0.32 with the MCLs, and the rationale is that we haven't completed the evaluation for soil water partitioning under the rules, I think that that's going to raise a lot of questions, because here's historically the way I've understood this has been applied. You begin with the provision that says, with respect to soils, which of course includes compost and biosolids as a solid material, leachate testing is not required to demonstrate compliance with sub-rule 1, which is the criteria, if the total concentration of a substance in soil does not exceed 20 times the lowest to John's point, the groundwater cleanup criterion is applicable at the facility or does not exceed the soil water partitioning value established under Rule 4, whichever is higher. Okay, so now that's 20 times or whatever information comes from soil water partitioning. But then 4 says the department may, if adequate data are available, establish acceptable soil concentrations based on soil water partitioning characteristics of a hazardous substance. So I think historically we would have defaulted to 20 times. And if adequate data is not available, you don't have soil water partitioning characteristics. So when it says 20 times or the soil water partitioning value, whichever is higher, you default to 20 times because you don't have a value. And 20 is higher than 0. So if, and Frank, I mean, those of you who know, I've been dealing with this for a long time. So somebody's going to say, where the heck is he going with his comments? I don't have any problem with the basic approach that you suggested, which is a thoughtful, reasonable way how to appropriately use and manage biosolids and compost. That's been done for a long time, and for those of you who don't know, I wrote the first biosolids application guidelines in 1978. So I'm very, very familiar with the value of this program. But I think if you look at an application to soils now, you're going to have to provide something to people to tell them that you're not defaulting to 20 times. Because if you're not, that's what would have been traditionally done. So now what happens with soils? Are we going to treat soils differently? Because unlike compost, which you'd assume would be used and distributed, so you can take a dispersion dilution factor into play, and presumably the same thing with biosolids. Is that the same thing with soils? I don't think compost, biosolids, and soils are equivalent. But if they're not, how are we going to treat them? And I think these questions, I think there's a lot of people, and I have a lot of respect, as I said, how Ann Arbor's approached this, but we've raised the question now about the use of these materials. And if we don't provide some better clarity, there are a lot of projects right now where there's soil being moved around. And what are we saying to people? What's the department going to say to people about the soils? Is that different than what you're going to say about compost and biosolids? And I know there's a lot of work going on, so part of my question is, maybe you can comment a little bit about where do you see this going? Because I know, John, you're working on the biosolids program. It's going to take time. Is it going to be the next 6 months? Is it going to be the next year? I think we probably need to provide greater clarity here because we've got landfills that won't accept material with levels here that you're suggesting can be used for compost purposes. I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with that conclusion. I just want to be clear that this is complicated for people who don't understand the nuances. And I think it really begs understanding timing schedules and where do you see this going and what guidance are you going to supply on construction projects, for example. I'm sorry there's a lot of questions rolled into that, and maybe you can parcel it out.
All right, Grant, I know you've been trying to get back here, so I'll just take the mic. Look, first of all, I appreciate your passion for this topic and how you're trying to address what we're all trying to address. This is a very, very complex issue that requires a lot of thought, a lot of time, and a lot of research. I think all of us in this room can be really, really proud of the effort that Michigan has taken and the leadership that Michigan has shown across the nation in terms of just those very elements, the research, the investigations, the assistance, the outreach. I don't think there's any other state in the nation that can say that they have done as much as Michigan, nor has been as proactive in reaching out to as many stakeholders as we can to work through this process together. Even though you implied there were a lot of questions to it, I'm not sure I heard a lot of questions. I heard a lot of statements in that. So I'm not really sure how to respond to you other than, yes, this is an ongoing process. Yes, the agency is dedicated to giving as much clarity to this process as we can. Our priority today is to make sure that we are protecting the 10 million people that rely on our water to consume on a daily basis. We think we have done a really good job at that. We have taken the time and invested the resources to make sure that happened. It's really easy to look at this and even as we were given the assignment, it's really easy to get overwhelmed really quickly when you get a deadline. And what you know, and you know how to do this, when you have a deadline, what you do is you allocate more resources and you create more hours by putting more people and more hours into that effort. So the same amount of work went into this that would have happened if we had spread it over a year. And I'm really, really proud of the team in terms of where they're at. I think these are very defensible standards. We're really impressed by the comments that we received and how we approached those comments and the thoughtfulness that went into them. That helps us do our job better. And you know, to the extent you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it. But again, it's not going to be black and white answers in all cases right now. Quite honestly, some of the things you've been talking about relate to the generic standard. I can't imagine a whole lot of people that want to do a generic cleanup in this state right now as it relates to PFAS. You're going to do a site-specific cleanup. You're going to do a risk evaluation based on the conditions on that property, the proximity to groundwater, proximity to sensitive stakeholders and other receptors. And as a result, we're going to end up sitting around a table working with the facility to make the best decisions everybody can to benefit the economy, to benefit that business, and to benefit the society as a whole.
I appreciate that, Aaron, and I think to a certain extent, and I apologize if it sounded more like a statement than a question, but what you said is really the type of thing I've been looking for, which is what you just described can be shared in a broader fashion. I think it's going to help a lot of people because I know we're hitting the spring construction season. There's going to be soil sampling done at different road projects and stuff like that, and the samples are going to come back and somebody say, what does it mean? And some clarity on there, I know because of other conversations I've been a part of, there's a lot of discussion on that right now. And the greater guidance that can be provided along the way you just described it, I think would be very helpful across all these areas. So
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And in fact, I would argue that is not even something for the future. It's something we've already been doing for the last year and a half as we've been learning more and more and dealing with facilities that have been dealing with this issue. So we're just going to continue that and continue to get better at that.
thank you.
Observation, and this really reaches beyond the technical role that we have as a committee member, but something that I want to encourage the departments with all the work that you've done, context is everything. And so as communications roll out, I think I learned so much from reading all of this, and it mattered when you boil down the concerns to cost or specifics like that, it actually, until you read how many does it really affect, and it puts it into context. There was one comment that talked about how when it's a state-only MCL, actually the requirement is not looking at cost, it's really public health priorities. And so it's really, I would just encourage, as you roll this out, even to address what you're talking about, Grant, it's the priority is public health, it's drinking water. We'll get to those things, or we are working on those. That fuller picture will make a lot of people, I think, understand how much is going on that may not be addressed yet, but when you have urgency with communities facing impacts, to wait for perfection in a moving science field will be of higher concern when you have 75% of the comments supporting it. But give that full picture about what comes next. There were so many comments about moving science and how will that be triggered. Give more information about, well, what will enable you to look at some of these things as you learn more. And I think a lot of people will go along, will actually understand you're working as fast as you can, but you're trying to protect public health. So I just, that context matters so much on all of these issues. So a very full communications effort, not just the specifics, it just will help everybody understand where you're trying to go.
So I think we're sort of already maybe into number 8, deliberation here, but I don't know. Dave, did you have anything you wanted to do to kind of set the table on this, on the next step here?
Yeah, I prepared some slides just to help you go through the process. Again, this is the first rule set we've taken through this process, and it's probably good maybe to step back and I can just maybe briefly run through the legislation that created your committee and what your duties are. So let's, what I'm doing is going to talk about the 4 sections of the Administrative Procedures Act that kind of explains what your duties are now. And this is section 66(8) through 12. So 66(8) we pretty much have accomplished. It basically says that within 120 days after the last public hearing that we held, that we should prepare and submit to you this JCAR agency report containing a synopsis of the comments made at the hearings, as well as any descriptions of the changes that we're proposing to make as a result of those public comments. So we've accomplished this section because the report was sent to you last Friday. So then it moves on to the next section, number 9, or section 66, paragraph 9, and it basically says that after you get the report and all of this data, you should meet one or more times to discuss the report and the comments, and then you are required to vote on this rule package. And you're able to either approve the rules as is, as stated, and I think the new rules that we've made those 2 minor corrections on, that draft rule set's dated February 21st, I think. So that's the rule set we're talking about. And you can either approve them, you can approve with modification, or reject them. And you have basically 120 days from the date you received this information, which was last Friday. So you have until May 30th to make this decision under the law, under the statute. And then if you fail to make this determination within 120 days, then the rules automatically proceed to the next rulemaking step, which is going to JCAR, basically. And then I'll move on to, well, let's just go back. And there was some discussion last meeting about what criteria should you be weighing these new rules against. And again, Bob Reichel from the Attorney General's office, who is here, he sent an email out to you, or I forwarded it on to you, and he explained that you can continue to use this criteria that is in another paragraph or another section of the Act, and this is the criteria you use before the public hearing process to either approve the rules going forward, and you can again use this criteria again to weigh the draft rules against. So I brought those up and I highlighted some of the important words in this section. And again, you can use this criteria to consider comments that were received also during the public comment period. So that moves us on to, what happens after you would take a vote and either approve or approve with modification or reject. So if you approve the draft proposed rules as they're currently stated, then they would go on to JCAR, which is this section 6612 that I'll talk about in a few minutes. If you approve with modification or reject the proposed rules, then it goes to the next section. And here, you would have to submit a notice of objection to our director of Eagle and to the governor explaining why the rules were either approved with modification or rejected. And then at that point in time, Eagle would attempt to resolve these issues. And if we were successful, then we could proceed on to the next step, which is JCAR. If we could not resolve those issues that you've identified in your notice of objection, then we would submit a written finding to the governor and kind of explain what our position is and why we're not agreeing to these, or we couldn't resolve those issues. And then it's up to the governor, and if the governor concurs with Eagle, then they would proceed to JCAR. If the governor does not concur, then the rules are withdrawn, and we would start the whole process over. And then again, section 6612 is basically, at this point, then the rules would move to, we would submit a big package of not only the JCAR agency report, but a number of other documents that we have to submit to the Michigan Office of Administrative Hearings and Rules. So they would look at what changes we made based on the public comments, and they would either approve or reject those changes to the rules. And then if they approve the package, they move it on to the, well, then they also send it to the Legislative Service Bureau, and their basic review is making sure the format of the rules are correct. They're not looking at the content, but they're looking at the format. And if they approve it, they issue a certificate, and those certificates from both Moore and LSB are joined with the package, and it's sent to, it is then sent to the JCAR, the Joint Committee on Administrative Rulemaking. And then just to complete this whole process, because we're getting kind of close to the end of the rulemaking process, when it goes before JCAR, it has to sit before JCAR for 15 full session days. It gives JCAR time to either react or take an action or take no action on the rule set. So one thing, if they did not take any action during those 15 full session days, then the rules get promulgated. And that's normally how in the past, our rule packages have been. They sit at JCAR for 15 full session days, nothing happens, they get promulgated. However, JCAR does have the ability to take some actions, and these 4 actions are kind of outlined on this slide. They could, if they wanted to, waive the 15 session days, full session days, because depending on the calendar, these waiting for 15 full session days could take months, many months, and could delay the rules from being promulgated. So often, on occasion, departments will ask JCAR to waive the 15 session days. Another action they could take is request that the agency make some changes that they want to see into the rules. And if the agency agrees, then we could do that. Or they could introduce bills to enact the subject of the rule into law. They have the ability to do that. And then finally, they could issue a notice of objection, and if they do that, they have to introduce bills in both of the House and Senate, and it's immediately placed on the calendars, and the bills then must either rescind the rule upon its effective date, repeal the statutory provisions under which the rule was authorized, or stay the rule's effective date for up to 1 year. And again, I'm not a lot familiar. We don't have a lot of experience with these last 3 bullets because it's never happened before in our department that I'm aware of. But it is something that is available to JCAR under the Administrative Procedures Act. So that is basically where we're at. That kind of gives you a better description of what the process is from now until the very end of the rulemaking process.
Questions?
And Dave, could you go back just a few slides where you described what's included in the JCAR package?
Let's see.
There it is, right there. So this is what goes to JCAR. Is there any provision to capture some of the concerns or discussion points raised by this committee in the JCAR package?
The JCAR package does not require us to do that. What they're focusing on, what Moore is focusing on, is making sure that the changes we do make to the rules after the public comment and public hearings, that those changes are grounded in comment. You know, we can't just after the public hearings decide that we're going to add or make some major changes to the rules because we just forgot about it and we just learned about it after the hearings, and we can't do anything that doing it that way. So they basically they're focusing on the written comments are associated with the changes we're making to the rules, and that's it. They don't require agencies to provide summaries of all comments from the written rules. They do require us to submit all of the written comments, and JCAR will get that package. But in normal rulemaking, they don't require us to summarize all the comments and addressing all of those comments.
Yeah, I see where you're going though, and because there are, obviously concerns that have been raised among the committee, I wonder whether it would make sense to, and I don't know, Dave, we talked, and I think you did this last time we had a vote, is kind of prepared a draft resolution for the committee, but regardless, I guess when we take action on the rules, one option would be to pass a resolution that, also sets forth some of the concerns that we want to see addressed or remain top of mind going forward. I guess the other option, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, we could always, as a committee, after we take action on the rules, submit a letter to JCAR, to the department, or the governor as well. If that's where I'm kind of hearing you're going, just making sure that some of our concerns are folks are conscious of those going forward.
Well, one of the ones that in particular that we talked about earlier, and with response to one of the questions that I had, was that there was, MPART did reach out to the Scientific Advisory Work Group to solicit some of their comments back to some of the written comments that were submitted. And right now, that's not captured anywhere in any of the material. I just want to make sure things like that get captured, that was done, in fact. And it somehow gets captured in what goes from here to JCAR. That's just an example.
Yeah.
Grant's got a number of concerns. So.
One thing our department does that is a little unique is that we do submit a briefing memo to JCAR to let them know kind of the status of our rulemaking, kind of give them a heads up. When JCAR is bombarded with a lot of materials when they do rulemaking, so what we like to try to do is provide them kind of a plain English discussion of what the changes are, give them background on the stakeholders. We provide we basically call it a briefing memo, and we send that out at the same time, about the same time Moore sends them the JCAR package. And so we do reach out to JCAR, letting them know if they have any concerns or issues, and we try to address those up front before they get all of these materials, because we know they aren't going to have time to go through everything in that huge package. But that is something that I'm sure we could add to this briefing memo. If that would address your concerns, I'm sure we could do that.
I think I have a question. It's mainly related to what Dave Greco mentioned, because if there is a report that was released last Friday, I think we got the package on Tuesday or Monday.
No, you got the package Friday afternoon.
Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
My question is that, are all the comments, and maybe this is more to Eric, because it's very technical in nature, it sounds like it. I haven't seen the report. Was that looked at or reviewed or reflected in your summary of the comments if the report was released Friday and the package was released to us on Friday?
Yes.
And it's 1,000 pages. If I read what Dave said is true.
There were several comment packets like that included very lengthy critiques of science and health-based values. NRDC submitted it. Several stakeholders and commenters did submit very lengthy attachments. And again, those were not all submitted on that Friday. So we had been reviewing comments all along. So it's not that we had to review all those in those 3 weeks. We've been reviewing comments, and those did not come in on the last day, most of those packages. So we did review those studies, and/or they were sent to MPART for their review that dealt with the health thing.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the email that we received from, and Dave, I think you forwarded that to us, I believe from, let me see if I can get to it. But essentially, it's we as a committee, we should be reviewing what is being proposed against the criteria that Dave just went through, but also in how we are responding to comment, considering those criteria as well. And that's the only reason why I'm asking. I need to understand a little bit more about whether all the comments that were received are reflected in the final version of the packet as you drafted it. That's right.
They definitely are. We reviewed each and every comment in that packet that you received.
Thank you.
And the MMA report, if I'm thinking of the same document, was in our was in the 1,000-page packet.
Yeah, you'll see
Right.
all those reports in that packet.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Same page.
Maybe you can answer this while we're on the topic of comment. So, I recognize that there were concerted, efforts and coordinated efforts amongst many environmental groups to submit comments. I know, NRDC, Sierra Club, Clean Water Action, LCV Environmental Council, and so on, who tracked probably, over 7,000 comments to my knowledge. So can somebody just describe the discrepancy between I think we're saying 3,300 and the numbers that I'm aware of?
The comments, the 3,300 is all the comments we received. Now, we did receive form letters, if you will, that were from certain environmental groups or certain stakeholders that people just signed off on. We summarized those, and Ian can speak to that. At the end of your packet, you'll see we received 334 of this form letter that has basically the exact same. We just presented one example of that form letter with a statement that we received X number of these that are all exactly the same. Where somebody submitted that form letter and wrote more comments on it, that actual comment will be reflected in your packet. But where they just submitted the form letter, we only summarized. We sent one example of that and then a number of those, the number that we received of those form letters.
Okay, so
to capture that.
So form letters were consolidated unless they had individual comments.
Yes,
essentially.
correct. Yeah, and Ian, correct me if I'm wrong or if you need to add.
So, yeah, Jeremy, all I can speak to is there were 3,334 physical comments that made it to us. And of those, if I were to estimate, just shy of 3,200 were form letters. Typically from those groups that you were mentioning. Other than those 3,334, I can't speak to where those perhaps ended up, but they did not make it to us.
So there is a process in which those will be consolidated before you actually receive them.
That I can't speak to. I can only speak to what we received at the inbox, which we would, to give you an idea, we may receive a single email with, for example, 1,300 comments from a particular group. That was something that happened. Each of those were counted individually, but I can't speak to any that we did not see come through that inbox.
Okay. Are there any more questions for Dave on the process and our options at this point? Is everybody clear on that? So I think really the next step then is to deliberate and decide which direction we want to go as to the options that were set forth. Approving the rules, approving with modifications, or rejecting, or I guess the other option that wasn't mentioned there would be to, table the issue for further study, given the 120-day period. But I'll open up the floor for any of the committee members to discuss further.
Just one
Sure.
question. No, I appreciate all the effort that Eagle had put into the comments and trying to gather all that and put that into one package. And I think, the committee members here have had, some opportunity in the days that we've had to review that. There's some questions that I have around, trying to get and expected some more details on the opposing comments to the rule and how those were handled. I know Eric mentioned earlier some of the details were sent to the Science Advisory Work Group. They viewed that their approach is still relevant and it moved on, but there was no explanation on the details behind that. I myself and the members that I'm representing on this committee haven't had the full time to digest all the comments that have come in and the substantive comments. And we do have some new members certainly on this board as well, and would like to look at potentially some additional time to review and vote on this item. To the open public comment period we had today, we heard some concerns there. Also, kind of go directly to one of the criteria that we're responsible to uphold, and this was the burden to industry and business. So with that, I just wanted to bring this up for discussion with the committee and look at a potential of a proposal to the committee to asking for more time, at least to the next meeting.
Grant?
In response to that suggestion, one can tell from the papers about my desk here, I try to review everything, and I was able to separate the comments into a separate PDF, and I thank you, David, for the suggestion that it was structured so it could be searched. Problem is, I can't, if I want to look for an NRDC comment, I can search for NRDC, but I haven't been able to read all of it because it's not indexed. So there's 670 pages, and when you cut out the common, the form letters at the back, there's still 660 pages. So to Dan's point, if we had more time, I would complete my review of the materials, which I can't do right now.
Okay. Any other comments from the committee? Helen?
Okay. Yeah, no, just going kind of back to the comments period. We talked about the number of comments received. Many of which were in favor, right? Even the neutral ones were determined to be in favor, right? We're talking near 100% of impacted communities, frontline communities, vulnerable communities, advocates who see this as a real public health issue, some even a crisis, are saying we need this right now, right? We need rules right now to protect our public health. And I think it'd be a step back in the wrong direction to continue to kick this down the road. We all have, questions, we all have concerns. I think Eagle has done a phenomenal job at answering to the best of their ability. And I think if we're really intentional about protecting public health and well-being and not getting sidetracked by things that are simply outside of the scope of what we came here to do today, then we need to move forward on this today. And I don't think, whether it's 30 more days, 60 more days is not going to change the hearts and minds of individuals and organizations who want to continue to review, because we're just continuing to delay and put people in harm's way.
Helen?
It's important for me to review what our role is too, and I think a big part of this is, do we believe that the agencies did an adequate job of addressing the comments? Not whether I did, whether and it's explicit that we are not to bring our own views. We're not invited to bring our own views and preferences. So I think it's really important, do we judge that, because I know we might not have had enough time, but they've got a fleet of people doing that. And do I believe that they've actually done an adequate job of that? And given the priorities that Jeremy was speaking to, I think we should move forward. I want to acknowledge too is that cost is an important issue for this issue. So I don't disregard that. I don't think 30 days of this committee will make a difference in that. I think what I see across the state on infrastructure, the comments from the Farm Bureau about the rural burden, et cetera, these are bigger issues than our committee can address or will be able to solve. I think that is an important issue in dialogue across the state about what is the state's role in helping people in burdensome situations to address this. We know we need to solve these issues, but extending our time will not address cost. It will not. It's actually something we need to continue to work on and figure out how we do that in a public-private way across the state, because it's going to have joint solutions to cost. So I think we should move forward. I think the priorities are clear for this committee that public health is the most important. And I'm not saying I don't respect the concerns being raised, but I don't think this would resolve that. I think that is, and that's why context is everything in the communications and how this is rolled out, that the agencies can go a long way of talking about how do we want to continue to address the issue of cost? How are we going to try to address the issue of ongoing science? And that everybody has to lean in and believe good intent, and that we will need to resolve these issues today. So I think we should move forward.
Thanks. Melissa?
Just want to jump on with Helen and Jeremy in this. I spent a lot of time reviewing this really with the lens of understanding were the public comments taken and considered by the department, and it is very clear that they are. And I think it's worth repeating that when you look at the comments, the vast majority are in support. Even those classified as neutral, I would have classified as in support, asking actually for more aggressive standards, not for less. And so I fully support voting here today on this, and I personally don't think I need any more time.
Grant?
I've been thinking about the collective comments that are being made now. And I appreciate the desire to move forward with the drinking water standards. And what I found myself struggling with, because I've been doing this type of thing for a long time, is it a matter of respect to the people who took the time and effort they did to put comments together, to have this committee have 4 days and not enough time to even read them? It's not a question of whether the department has reviewed them. They've had them for 30 days. We've had them for roughly 4 days. If you opened them up on Friday, you've had them for 6 days. And I've got uncomfortable with the idea of thinking that I was going to take an action without having completed my review. And as I thought about that, I understand there's a desire to move forward, but here's the flip side of that. I think most of the public water supply systems, and Eric, you can react to this because you're in that milieu, already know this is an issue and they got to deal with it, and I don't think 30 days changes their attention to that. So I tend to fall on the side of, let's show some respect to the amount of effort that went into the comments, and at least have an opportunity for all of us to look at those. To the point of whether it changes the vote between today or 30 days from now, it may or may not. But I found myself concluding, I'd like to finish reviewing the comments, and I haven't had a chance to do that. And so I'm not asking for a personal preference as a member of the committee. I view it in the context of there's a lot of effort went into this. I mean, the NRDC document's 100 pages long, and all I did was read the cover letter. And Environmental Council, I scanned it, and I got to the edits and the rules on the provision that talked about the 2-year cycle. So are there other things out there that would be worthy of comment or questions or clarifications? I don't know, because I haven't finished reviewing them. So that's kind of where I came down on it. Thank you.
Yeah, Eric?
You know, as I read through go back to process, the Eagle is required to review and put in report form to us the comments. I don't see anything in here, and I could be wrong, Dave, that says that our responsibility is to read every comment that was made. We're supposed to understand, we're supposed to accept the report unless, I guess, somebody is claiming that the report is inaccurate or misleading. As I'm going through the process, we're just supposed to receive it. We received it. It was discussed. I don't know necessarily that I agree, Grant, that we would wait 30 more days just out of respect for the people that submitted comments. They've been submitting them since December. So I think that, my opinion is representing public health, we should move forward today.
Yeah, Chuck?
Sure, just briefly speaking, as a new member, I think it's been very impressive to hear from a team at Eagle that's pulled together, as was mentioned by staff, in a constrained time frame, but also devoting the extra resources and attention necessary to move forward on what's a serious public health issue. From my perspective, again, as a new member and somebody, of course, this is my first meeting, but being provided with a summary of the comments, which is typical. And I think we also have, just as we depend on the department to look at the comments as they're received, which is, of course, what was done,
There's also a need to depend on the department to consider the comments that were made in opposition and the science in those. So from my perspective, I don't think that there is value in further delay. I've had a chance to study the history of this issue and the committee and how we've worked on this. I just don't, functionally, I don't see the value for the committee, for the department, for all of the commenters on every side of this issue for another 30-day delay. It just doesn't make sense from an operational perspective, in my view.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think the biggest challenge we've been faced with here is the timing. You know, the goal of getting these done in a year. It's certainly been a challenge, and you know, it's not the norm, and I think that's been recognized. But obviously, it's an urgent public health issue as well, and so I think a lot of the kind of tension has come from that. Condensed time frame where you know, there's a condensed time frame to dive into the rules, to look at the science, to get comments in, and of course a condensed time frame for the department to consider those. And so, you know, I think that you know, it kind of highlights the importance of that stakeholder process and taking those into consideration going forward. You know, from my perspective, I kind of look at the comments, and you know, we've had them for a little less than a week, and there's a lot there to digest. I mean, personally, I view it as, you know, you've got some of those reports that really drill into the science and of the health-based values and how those were developed. And you know, I'm not a scientist. To some extent, we've got to sort of trust the MPART and the Science Advisory Work Group and the department, but also, you know, I think we need a type of commitment from them that, you know, as the science develops and more studies are done, that they're committed to taking those into account and getting those right. I think we've heard that today, and also, because of that condensed time frame, I think, you know, if you had a 2-year time period to get rules done, which is sort of the norm, you know, people have more time to get their input in earlier, probably more time to sit down with the department and help develop the rules on the front end, which again was kind of a function of the accelerated process here. I guess from my perspective, and you know, I totally hear what you know, the issues you're raising, Grant, on the remediation topics. You know, I hear the comments that various groups have raised about the health-based values and what went into calculating those. I'm not sure you know, if we were to delay another 30 days, what the end game would really be, because to make further changes to the rules, you'd be sort of rewinding things several steps back from where we are now, and that's unfortunate, but I think it is kind of a function of the accelerated timeline that's been set forth for these rules. So, you know, my personal view is, again, it's unfortunate that things have been condensed, but I don't know that, and I think you acknowledge this, I'm not sure what would really change in 30 days, because if we were to, you know, reject the rules at that point or require modifications, you know, we'd potentially be rewinding this whole process back to have to go through public hearings again as well. So that's kind of where my head's at.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, I don't know if it can be done within 30 days. Having to review that, I think what the department have done, going through all the comments in such a tight time frame, it's really good. Eric, you talked about it's not light speed, but just to put it in context, what would it take to promulgate an MCL typically for getting this current process?
It's hard
What's
to
been
say from a
this?
state standpoint because we've never done it before as a state.
Okay.
So I have no benchmark. And it's hard to say from a state standpoint because we've never set an drinking water MCL as a state, so I've got no benchmark to drag it or compare it to. The only process I have to compare it to is the federal EPA process, which is a 3 to 4 year process at best. And I defer to Chris, but there have been no MCLs set in the federal process for a very long time.
I agree.
So the consideration of whether you're being truly protective of public health by delaying the establishment of an MCL for that long a period of time, you know, that's what I'd throw on the table for debate.
Yeah. And at least for me, the struggle is with that. Is on one hand, we understand the priorities for the MCL and trying to pass something because of public health and making sure that we have that. On the other hand, we want to be able to have the time with the information and the publics and try to evaluate that. Unfortunately, for me at least, most of the comments are technical nature. And I don't think 30 days is going to allow us, we as a committee, to be able to evaluate the science, or at least make a judgment that, except to rely on the department to say that we've gone through it, reviewed it, and this is a good package to get us through. We discussed, we have a process in place that these health-based value, or MCL, could be revised at some point as new science comes in, new studies that we can evaluate and go forward. I think there could be some reliance on that going forward. I like the idea of resolution that will have some information in it that gets it through the system, that this further review and considering, and I know the department didn't spend a lot of time looking at the technical reports, except to going through it as quickly as they could, and you've heard it takes about 3 to 4 years historically to go through an MCL. Here we're doing it in less than a year. I think that they could use the time during then and JCAR review to be able to engage with the stakeholders that have issues to see if there is any revisions that needs to be made from my standpoint.
Eric?
To let you guys know where my head was, it was Dave's question about whether or not the Science Advisory Group, work group, had been reconvened. And we understand that they, and the answer that I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, I heard them, they didn't reconvene the Science Advisory Work Group, but they did send them the comments, I guess, the opposed comment, and would you take a look at this, and do you agree, do you still stand behind your numbers? And we were given an affirmative. I do think it's important that that's in the record, but when I heard that today, you know, that's, again, none of us here sitting at this table are toxicologists. And the fact that that they did affirm or confirm that they were sticking to their numbers at this point in time, that's what I needed to hear. So that was kind of my decision making.
I guess what I'd like to do, if Dave could go back to the 5 criteria that again, we're supposed to look at it, and we affirmed that these are the criteria we're supposed to use initially, and then after we heard the public comments and the discussion today, again, this is what we're supposed to take a look at going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, similar to what we did the last time, can we just kind of go down through here and check off yes or no whether or not it's met these? Or is the question going to be, if I have 30 days to review the comments, will I be able to make an answer then? That's really what we're talking about, I think.
Right.
And so I think we can just kind of read down through those. The draft proposed rules reasonably implement and apply the statute authorizing the rulemaking is consistent with all other applicable law. I think the last time we did this, the answer to that was yes, and I don't believe that's changed. based on the public comments. The draft proposed rules are necessary and suitable to achieve their purposes in proportion to the burdens they place on individuals and businesses. And I think their purposes overall, is to protect the public's drinking water. There are some ancillary things that are linked to it that are really causing some issues, and we brought those up all along the process, particularly with Part 201 that Grant's addressed, is that it's triggering other things. And I think as these rules move forward, assuming they move forward into the form they are, the department is going to have to work with the affected parties and sort all this out. It is what it is right now. We've been told that we're not talking about Part 201 here, that states that the values are triggered by whatever we do in the drinking water standpoint. I'm looking at James, but I think that's what we've all decided. That's what's going to happen. So I wish that weren't the case. Personally, I wish there was some way that was separated from this. I think it would allow us to focus on what we're really supposed to be focusing on, the rules focusing on, which is the drinking water standards. But it is that part is what it is right now.
That also, we discussed this, and that was and I think the Farm Bureau might have brought this up. There's also the cost to the municipalities or the public water supplies if they exceed this MCL. And I think what we heard from the department here was they've done a pretty aggressive sampling already. I forget the number, but we know, I want to say it was 11 are going to exceed once this becomes a rule. And those 11 already, I believe, know this. And then there was additional non-community water supplies that still needed to be sampled. But if we looked at the actual numbers based on all the other sampling we did across the state, we could do some projection that it was going to be a handful more would exceed for that additional cost. I think we should make sure that we've looked at that thoroughly, and there's not a lot more that we believe are going to exceed at this time. Understanding groundwater can change.
The third one up there is the draft proposed rules are clear and unambiguous, as reasonably appropriate considering the subject matter. Well, I think the rules are pretty straightforward. I think we all know what the rules are. I mean, it's pretty easy to read as far as that part goes.
To that point, Dave, Eric and I had a chance to meet with staff to talk through some of the language that's in the rules. I do believe there's some ambiguity there, but we couldn't come with a consensus to modify it. So I wouldn't say that that you're probably correct that standard is met.
That there is some ambiguity there.
But it wouldn't rise to the level of saying the criteria is not met. We couldn't come to consensus to modify it, and we left it to the staff to accept the challenge. If questions get raised, they're going to have to explain it.
Right. And I guess the last point is that the draft proposed rules are based on sound and objective scientific reasoning. And, as we go forward with this process, I mean, this affects this set of rules, but this is going to affect every rule that we look at. This is our criteria to look at any rule that comes forward. I think we need to have a more clarification on what is meant by sound and objective scientific reasoning. Is it the scientific advisory group getting together for 3 months and looking at what science they can get their hands on and saying it's a good thing, and then they go forward and there's no peer review or there's no feedback from other interested parties that gets factored back into that? Most science that I know that takes place is someone comes out with an idea, they publish it. If there's a comment, the commenter makes a written comment regarding the initial paper, and then the original author of the paper has an opportunity to respond to that. There's a back and forth that takes place in a lot of scientific processes and scientific thought. That's why I asked the question earlier, to make sure that in fact had taken place, because I hadn't seen that in the document. So I think it is important that be done. I'd also encourage at some point to have a written response from the scientific advisory group back to the comments stating why they think the way they do. I mean, the setting of an MCL is a big deal. Obviously, Michigan's never done it before. So, but it's also going to be going down the road as we look at other rules as well. But given that, the fact that they have been at least consulted coming back, I've still got some questions about that, but I think in general, in my own mind, I can check that one off the box as well, as far as the sound and objective scientific reason.
Since you're looking at me, this is a really interesting one to me, because as Eric said, none of us are toxicologists, but I've spent a fair amount of time since about 1986 on all the criteria discussions over the years, including the development of the 20 times rule, which came out of the T-clip methodology, and that was the old 307 rules before we even had an Act 201. And there's something I'm struggling with respect to the sound and objective scientific reasoning, and it has nothing to do with the people who are working on it. It has nothing to do with disparate views on what risk levels are acceptable. And I was putting some thought into this. I want to read something, because this is the best way I could come up to summarize this concern. The issues surrounding these criteria are not as simple as setting, quote, drinking water standards, and are based on a risk assessment process that may be inadequate to deal with emerging contaminants at parts per trillion levels. Correcting this deficiency will require development of an updated risk assessment and standard setting methodology, and will take much more time than is available to deal with current PFAS issues. Over time, we should do better. Consider the following. If the risk assessment process were easy or as straightforward as 2 times 2 equals 4, then everyone would get an answer of 4. The attached graph, and I have a graph that Eagle produced as part of one of the presentations, lists 5 states' proposed standards or adopted standards in the last couple of years, and they vary. So referencing that graph, this graph illustrates the struggles inherent with current risk assessment methodologies. 5 states working diligently with 5 different results. How can so many qualified professionals working in good faith differ to such an extent? Because the tools are subject to so much variation based on the judgments made and the assumptions used in the analysis. The results are as different as the professionals who performed the analysis. Yet what will be considered a violation of the proposed MCLs, generally referring to that graph, in Michigan, will not be so in New York, Minnesota, New Hampshire, or New Jersey. Are the residents of these states not being protected? Not according to their professionals. So I think we're on the edge of a problem where we have tools that have been used historically that don't work anymore. And I say that for the following fundamental reason. I've had conversations with a number of experienced toxicologists, and I've asked a fundamental question. What's the difference between 15 and 30 with respect to these numbers? And you know what the answer was? There is no material difference from a risk assessment toxicologist perspective. Because remember, we start with a lab test, and we had this discussion when we were talking about the language, about, okay, the lab rat got a such and such dose, and here's what happened. But by the time you take it through this process, you're taking an assumption times an approximation to get to a number. And here's the problem. We put it in an MCL, and we say that the drinking water standard is 12. Is 13 a violation of that drinking water standard? The statute and the rules will say it is, but I challenge the experienced risk assessment toxicologist to conclude that it is materially different. I don't think we are in an milieu now where the science backs up where the regulatory process is going. And I really struggle with that. And I think, and that's not again, I don't mean to raise this as a question not to adopt these rules. I'm not criticizing. Deb and I have had conversations over the years about different types of things, as well as I have with other people in the department. I just think we need a better tool. We need a better process than we have now. We're not going to solve it today. And James is eager to say something.
Just briefly, I go back to the science advisory group that MPART used, and they clearly pointed out 2 things, that there was actually a trend line on states that have been setting these standards, and it wasn't that they were all over the board, that they had been coming down as more and more science had been done, and that Michigan kind of was following that trend line, and 2, that they thought that this represented the best available science at this time.
Okay. Any further comment? Or I would entertain a motion as well if we want to move forward.
I'm just
Yeah, Helen?
working for a science-based organization. This is about leadership and governance and making good judgments based on the best available information. So it's never going to be perfect. It's very hard to get scientists to actually call a perfect shot because there's so much in motion. So I think, I understand what you're saying, but I think it's really about taking informed action. And it's never going to be perfect for you. So, just it's
perfect, I'm just looking for better.
yeah. And as we know, we're going to have to continuously adapt as science emerges. So.
Jeremy?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the rules.
Okay.
Support.
All right. We need Eric Bissell. Any discussion on that motion?
I mean, I will support the motion. However, I would like to ask if we can make a slight modification to have some way to incorporate the comments and the issues that have been raised here today, either in the brief that comes from Eagle to JCAR, or some way to capture some of the concerns we've had, as well as document in the packet the fact that the Scientific Advisory Work Group was reached out to and did have a chance to provide some comments back, and if possible, in the JCAR package to capture some of those comments in writing. I just would like to make sure we are documenting the whole process, and as well as some of the concerns that were raised by Grant on the Part 201 and some of those issues. So I'm supportive of the motion. I think we do need to move forward to address the drinking water piece of it with what we have right now. But there are some things that I think need to be communicated on from this committee, although it doesn't say in the statute that we're supposed to. It sounds like we have a vehicle to do that, and I think that would be important.
I would support that if Jeremy is willing to modify.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that as a modification according to the statute. Yeah, yeah, but I mean, I see that as like a promise from, I don't know, Eagle to make the effort to do that.
Yeah.
Is that just a matter of a commitment from them saying they will do that?
Yeah,
Maybe what,
Make it part of the motion, and then they will.
Okay.
right, and maybe practically speaking, what we can do is, I'm happy to take the lead on that committee and work with Dave and, I'll solicit everybody's input to kind of make sure we capture that in the proper way. Everyone, the various concerns and that have been noted around the table, either through the JCAR report or a separate letter, find the right vessel to get that that statement, follow the rules through the rest of the process. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, just make an observation. I'm not advising you that you should do this or have to do this, but every one of these minutes are made of these meetings. Sorry, thank you. The minutes are taken of each of these meetings. The minutes reflecting the discussion that you've engaged in over the last 2 hours or thereabouts, including the very specific concerns that members of the committee have expressed, and the comments by committee members that in deliberating on this, it was important that there had been that there had been an affirmation that department staff reached out to members of the Scientific Advisory Work Group. I think all of that is going to be reflected in your minutes, presumably. I'm not saying that.
Excuse me, are our minutes part of the JKR package?
No, they would not be, but I've heard different suggestions. One, I heard department staff indicate that they would entertain putting in their communications to JCAR, this briefing report. I understood there to be a commitment by staff to do that. Among other things, a specific statement that, as staff indicated, the staff did review the technical comments with the Scientific Advisory Work Group. And so certainly that is an option. And I'm just suggesting as a supplemental measure, it's not specifically called for in the statute, but to the extent that the committee wanted to communicate further or more directly with JCAR, there would be nothing to prevent the chair from transmitting to JCAR a copy of the minutes of this meeting, which would presumably encompass each of the items that you've discussed today. I just offered that as a suggestion.
Actually, Rob, the minutes tend to be about a page and a half long, and they recount motions, but nothing in the substance of discussion. The only thing we have that records this is the recording and however long that lasts.
Okay.
So with that understanding, is part of your concern leaving something that got reduced to writing without the vote of the whole committee?
Well, first of all, I wasn't expressing a concern necessarily. I was trying to be responsive
Understand.
to the discussions raised by members of the committee and just offering a suggestion.
Yeah.
I don't quarrel with you that the minutes may not, in practice, be that detailed. It was just a thought. I guess, to summarize, are the recordings of this meeting that are live streamed, is a record maintained of that?
Yes.
Again, I'm not suggesting you have to do this, but in addition to the proposal to have Eagle staff communicate themselves to JCAR, the fact that this consultation with the Scientific Advisory Work Group occurred, there would be nothing to prevent the committee, if it so chose, to send a letter to JCAR reiterating or just identifying factors that influence the decisions made or ultimately made by members of the committee. Again, I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm just offering that as
But it boils
perhaps a
down then,
suggestion.
it boils down then to a question of process, whether
Correct.
we rely on the recording and say to JCAR, go watch the recording, or if the chair took the lead in preparing something that got circulated among the members and was, if signed off, then got forwarded by the chair through the report. And I think that's where you were headed.
Yeah.
So,
I think a letter prepared by the chair, if you would be willing to do so, kind of summarizing some of the concerns would be more practical than expecting them to listen to this for 2 hours. I think that's just,
Yeah.
I mean,
Agreed.
it's probably not going to happen, so.
No, understood. And Mr. Trigger makes a good point that I had overlooked, that the level of detail in the minutes was not what I had assumed. So to answer, there's certainly the proposal made by the chair to circulate within the members of the committee a document that would document or simply reflect some of the key points that have been discussed here that are relevant to the votes taken by the members and getting their consent to that. There's nothing to prevent that from happening. I guess just as a process matter, from a parliamentary standpoint, we need to be, I don't know that this requires an amendment of the motion that's on the floor, but if there is a desire by members of the committee to have this process for having a letter from the chair, then perhaps that should be included in the text of the motion so that it's clear what the members are voting on.
Agreed, and I think that's where you were going with your friendly amendment to Jeremy's motion, right? To authorize the chair to work with Eagle to prepare a supplement, we'll say, to our decision and is that a fair summary? Okay.
Yeah, I accept that amendment.
Okay. All right. Any further comment on the motion? Yeah. Sure.
I support that.
Okay. Any further discussion on the motion that's on Jeremy's main motion that's on the table? All right. Let's vote. All in favor of the motion made by Jeremy to the rules and to have the chair work with the department to prepare a supplement to our decision describing the factors that went into our decision and ongoing concerns. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Noted. Mr. Frakes, wait, I don't know if we need to do a roll call, but maybe we should have done a roll call. Did we capture everyone? So we've got everyone in favor. Mr. Trigger and Mr. Frakes abstain. All right, that the motion passes. And I will, I'll put something together and circulate it, obviously, for the group. Dave, I don't know, do you have what's the time frame from here to get, to send this on to
We're going to do
the
it
office
fairly.
and then JCAR?
Yeah, we're going to do it fairly quickly. What I have to do is enter a lot of this information into a online software system that goes to Mohar to start the process. I don't know if you want me, if I could proceed with that. It's going to take a little while before it goes through Mohar and LSB before it goes to JCAR, but maybe during that period we could have that letter developed, and so by the time it actually goes to JCAR, it'll be accompanied with the letter.
Makes sense to me. Yeah, of course. We'll circulate it to the committee first before doing anything. But
Yeah.
Okay.
A couple other notes. Then, according to the act, you've completed your stakeholder review of this rule process. So there's no other steps necessary for you to meet again on this rule package. Therefore, and I've consulted with the other programs within our department. There's no other request for rulemaking coming up in the near future. So I don't think we would need to have our meeting in March unless you have other reasons to meet, but there's nothing really on the docket to talk about. You may not have a meeting until towards the end of the summer. There's not a whole lot. We're hearing a couple of rule packages that will be proposed maybe towards the end of the summer. So there may not be a meeting for quite some time.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, Eric.
Just for clarification, you're going to send something around to all of us before it goes into the report, correct?
Correct.
For us to review?
Yes. And, I do want to just acknowledge the work that the committee's put in on this rule set. It was kind of our first rule set we were really, truly, had to engage with and work through, and obviously on a very accelerated time frame. I wanted to thank the department as well for, fully engaging with the committee and being responsive to our requests and our concerns. Thanks to all the members of the public and the stakeholders who, spent a lot of time and effort attending public hearings and preparing very thoughtful comments in response to this proposed rule set. And so, yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for their hard work and efforts to get us to this point. So, thank you. And the final item on the agenda is adjournment. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Second. All in favor? Aye. We're adjourned. Thanks, everybody.